So do you ever wonder how people end up doing really horrendous things, specifically to my point this afternoon, people that call themselves Christians or at one time called themselves Christians? And I think it's an important question. I mean, if we don't want to end up doing terrible things, then we should at least think about sometimes, how do people end up doing things? I'm not talking like I told a lie, although don't, but I'll give you the specific example that we're going to talk about today. Like, how did Judas end up selling Jesus for some silver? Like, how did he get to that point? And, we can fill in a lot of blanks, right? Like, I know my wife and I were just talking about, like, so many couples that seem like they'll never get divorced, and then they end up just hating each other. And it's like, what happened there? And then they do get divorced, by the way. But what happened there? Because I don't think any of us want to believe that, like, it's a light switch thing, right? Like that you can just wake up and all of a sudden you just do something terrible. And I think in the story of Judas' life, we see these steps that can lead to worse and worse things. And I think it's really important to look at them. And here's what's happening, just to catch you up to speed. We're doing this series of sermons. I've been preaching through the book of John since the beginning of October, but we're breaking that down into mini series that go with the different section breaks in the Gospel of John. And last week we moved to this new section where Jesus turns his attention to his disciples, and he's going to tell them all of these things about how they can live for him, how they should live for him, what's required of living for him after he is gone, after he's died, risen, and then ascended into heaven. And I told you I was really excited to preach that, and I am. But there's kind of this outlier section in the middle of this bigger section. Because all of this, for those of you who weren't here last week, like, we've covered almost 3 years of Jesus' life in 12 chapters of the book of John. And then all of a sudden we're going to cover just 24 hours in the next 5 chapters. And so it's all like one little small period of time where Jesus' attention, like I said, is really turned to his disciples. But in the midst of all this, and you might know this, you've been around church for any period of time at all, you might already know this, Jesus talks about how somebody is going to betray him, and then he reveals that person is Judas. And that's kind of the whole part of our section. But for me, I'm like, it's weird. That's weird to be in the middle of a kind of a section that's all about being a follower of Jesus and what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And as I pondered that this week, because I was preaching on it, I thought, you know what? This is really about the steps required to no longer follow Jesus, the steps required to move further away from following Jesus, the steps required to end up doing horrendous things despite having, been a Christian or followed Jesus, or in Judas' case, spent tons of time with Jesus and seen all the miracles and everything. These are really I think we see in Judas, the steps that move us towards doing things that we never could have thought that we could do if you would have asked us, a year or 2 or 3 ago. In this sermon, it's kind of my hope. I was watching this TV show, I don't know if this is by God's grace or by chance or what, but this character in the TV show was playing Judas in his family's, in his church's play for Easter. And he doesn't know how to do it, and he's having trouble getting into the mindset. He's a nice guy, and so it's hard to think, Judas-like. And somebody just says, what is Judas? Just think about what he's like when he's not betraying Jesus. What is Judas? Who is Judas? Like an actor would do. And I think that's kind of what I want to talk about today a little bit. What was it about Judas that allowed for him to get to a place where he sold Jesus for some silver? what got him to that place. Now, one of the things you need to know about Judas, one of the 12 disciples, like the guys who hung out with Jesus 3 years, ministered with him, ministered for him, saw the miracles, heard the speeches, like all this stuff that we've seen in John. Judas was one of the guys who got to experience it firsthand on a daily basis. This is really interesting, but he's like the only disciple that's listed by the name that we know him by in all 4 of the Gospels. That sounds really nice for Judas, but it's almost always said like this in Luke 6:6. Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Like that's how it's almost always worded at the beginning of these Gospels. Like they tell his story. They even introduce him as the one who would betray Jesus. And in the passage we look at today, Jesus predicts this. And remember, that's so staggering to me because he's just given his disciples this example of foot washing that I preached on last week. So Jesus begins saying, hey, this is how you live for me. And the first thing he does is he washes his disciples' feet. And we talked about how he shows them in this that part of being his disciple is humbly and sacrificially serving other people. And then right after that, it's like a big switch. This is what we read. I'm not referring to all of you. I know those I have chosen, but this is to fulfill this passage of Scripture. He who has shared my bread has turned against me. I am telling you now before it happens, so that when it does happen, you will believe that I am who I am. Now, we've already been told that Judas is going to be a betrayer of Jesus. And so, like, for me, maybe you're not as curious as me, but like, why does he become a disciple in the first place, right? And I think most of the time when that question arises, people will point to the fact that somebody needed to betray Jesus so that he could be arrested and tried and mocked and tortured and crucified for the sins of the world. And I think there's something really good about that answer and important about that answer. But actually in our passage, there's 2 reasons that Jesus points to in this passage. And I think they're important. One, it fulfilled Scripture. Psalm 41:9, even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread has turned against me. And so Jesus shows us that even in this betrayal by Judas, the promises, the prophecies of the Old Testament were fulfilled. I think this is incredible proof that Jesus is, as John is trying to prove in his gospel, the Messiah, the Son of God who has come so that those who believe in him may have eternal life. But on top of this, Jesus predicts it. And as he predicts it here, he says, this will help you believe that I am who I say I am. This is the Messiah, the Son of God, and I actually think there might be a reference there to Jesus' deity, which has been just all the way through the book of John, that Jesus is God in human form. And so Jesus says, I'm predicting this, I'm telling you about this in part so that when I die, you can know that I'm still the one I say I am. I love that. I think by extension of that, it helps us believe the story. But for these first century disciples, I mean, think about how hard of a moment that is. I mean, they believe that he's the Messiah. They're all in on that idea. They've made that clear. But then he's going to be tortured and killed, and that doesn't fit their idea of what the Messiah is supposed to do. And so Jesus is taking this awful thing that's going to be done by Judas, and he's using it to help his disciples continue to believe even as all of this terrible stuff happens to him. God even uses the betrayal of Jesus to help us believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. Now, this is what John 13:20 says. Very truly, I tell you, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one who sent me. This is really familiar sounding, and it reminds us of what Jesus has made really clear, that to accept him is to accept God because he is God in human form. He has equality with God. He is equal to God. But next we get back to the Judas stuff. After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. His disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which one of them he meant. One of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to the disciple and said, ask him which one he means. Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish." Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. Now, when I read this part, it's just strange to me. Like, they're all sitting down at dinner and Jesus makes this prediction and then Peter has to like whisper almost, "Hey, ask him what he means," like it's just like this awkward thing. And so I want to put up the picture of traditionally how people see the seating chart of the Last Supper. Now, like the painting, right, of the Last Supper, and they're all in a line and one guy's over there and one guy's over there. But this is the more traditional kind of seating of the Roman world, and it makes some sense. So Peter actually would be in the last place kind of spot here, and there's probably something important there, but we'll save it for another day. But then John, or the disciple whom Jesus loved, is sitting there, and they're reclined, so they kind of sit. It looks horrible when I was looking this up. Like, they kind of got to lay and eat, and like the whole thing, it's like somebody build a chair. And really, the Passion of the Christ, remember that movie? And Jesus builds the first chair. Like, that made more sense to me after looking at it. Not a factual part of the story, but like, I would have made a chair if I was Jesus. But then like Judas is right there next to him. So you got John and Peter. And so when you picture it like this, it makes more sense that Peter kind of has his head here and he's like, "Hey, ask him who he means." And then the dipping, like you can see how he's gonna dip the hand next to the bread given this seating chart. So that's what's going on at this Last Supper, but it's still kind of uncomfortable, right? I mean, there you are. It's like a game of like, who done it, like a murder mystery. Like Jesus, like, one of you is going to betray me, and all of them are like looking around like, not me, right? Like, who is it going to be? And he reveals that it is Judas. And this is what we see next. As soon as Judas took the bread, this is the line. I mean, just this line is crazy. I've never noticed it. I've never thought about this phrase, but Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, what you're about to do it quickly. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. Since Judas had charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. As soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. Satan entered into him. That's staggering. I mean, like, we've heard of, maybe seen movies about demon possession, but here this phrase says it's not just demon possession, it's Satan possession. Like, the prince of demons, the head of all the dark forces, enters into Judas. And what I think, it's like, could that happen to me at dinner tomorrow? I mean, is there build up here? Because like, when you're just reading through, it's really easy just to be like, wow, that sucks for him, like, was there nothing else? And I think we could leave this going like, could it be that easy that just Satan, boom, and then all of a sudden I totally betray and reject and, turn Jesus in and hate Jesus and do something so horrendous as selling Jesus? Like, I mean, you can there's so many things that we do. And like, I mean, like I talked about like people that get divorced that I never could have seen it coming. But like, I think that nobody sets out to be a murderer, but then they, at some point, there's murderers, right? And like, how do you, like, what happens there? Or even just like things that maybe are smaller, like I could never steal from my company, but then people do, right? And they start to commit fraud and things like, how do we get there? Does Satan just, and then it's over? I do all of these things. But I think when you try to take a more holistic picture of Judas, and you don't just remember this moment, you start to see the things that led to this, that allowed for him to be in a position where Satan would come into him, where Satan would choose to use him as his vessel of destruction. And just going back a chapter in John 12, 4-6, I alluded to this when we kind of passed by it, but notice it again. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected, "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. Now this takes place, and when this person comes and they pour perfume and nard on Jesus' feet, and this woman uses her hair and she's wiping his feet with her hair, and then Judas tries to put a stop to it, and we learn the reason why, because he was a thief and he was taking a little money off the top. Now there's a step, right? And I think the first step, this lines up with my experiences. The first step oftentimes to people doing the things they never could have thought is doing the little things that they never thought anybody would see in the first place. I can just now I'm making this up, but I can just picture, because I've known a lot of people, because I am a person, like I can just picture like that first time when Judas decides to take a little bit of the money. I mean, here comes the money. Here comes the money, and people are giving this money so that Jesus, and the disciples could do their ministry. They have the things they need. They could give to the poor, all of this stuff. And Judas is like, who's going to notice if $1 missing, right? Like, nobody will ever know. Like, it's not going to hurt anybody. It's not like that. I mean, it's that, the poor person, they should get a job anyway. Like, I mean, you know all the rationalization, right? Because you and I do it sometimes. Nobody will ever know. It's not going to cause a big problem. I know the books better than anybody. We'll still have enough money for the hotel room. Like, it's just not that big a deal. I'll never get caught. Nobody knows who comes in. It's opportunity, right? Like, he has this opportunity, and so he does this sin that I'm sure seemed so inconsequential at the time. And I think that probably the sin that seemed like not a big deal, that didn't seem like it would have any effect on anybody else, it was probably the first step in several steps, we'll look at a couple more, that led to Satan entering him and him selling Jesus for some silver. And I want this to be a warning to each and every one of us. Now, it's not like, I don't think it usually works like this, like, oh, I told a lie today, Satan's entering me tomorrow. Like, that's not what this looks like. But there is a warning for us here. If we start to do the sins that seem inconsequential, if we start to do the things that we know are wrong, that we know God doesn't want us to do, it is the beginning of the process that may lead to us doing things that we never thought we would ever do. Now, I actually think that in that passage I just read, we see a second step. And the second step is that his sin begins to stand in the way. It becomes, and it comes to a place where it's in conflict with his worship of Jesus, or worship of Jesus. I'm guessing that, you can tell there, like he's been stealing for a while, right? And now here is this moment where Jesus is honored and Jesus is worshiped, and Judas' sin that he's been committing now causes him to try to stop the honor and the worship of Jesus. He doesn't want to deal with it anymore. He looks at this moment where Jesus is getting the glory, but because of the sin in his life that it seemed like nobody would ever notice, he's trying to stop Jesus from being glorified because it negatively affects him and his bottom line. And I think that this can happen to us, right? We do the little sins, no big deal. I'm still going to church, I'm still singing my songs to Jesus. But if we do that over time, there's going to come a point, none of it's honoring to Jesus, but there's going to come a point where it starts to bother us when Jesus is being honored. I think we can see this in like how annoyed we can be by those who are doing the right thing when we're doing the wrong thing. I don't know if you ever felt that. Maybe I'm the only person who ever felt that. But like when we see people who are living the way that we should be living, and we know that we're intentionally, willfully not living that way, we start to be bothered by them, and we can even be naysayers towards them, right? Like we can put the peer pressure on them, like, oh, everybody's doing it. Dumb, stupid little example, but you're taking a little extra break at work, and you're I'm taking 35 minutes for lunch or whatever it might be, and I'm only clocking for 30, just telling that little teeny baby lie, and then somebody else is like, well, I don't feel good about that. And you're like, come on, like there's anger instantly. Like, what? Like, just do it. It's not a big deal. Nobody's going to notice. And so we become the voice, right, of not bringing Jesus the honor and the worship that he deserves. And so Judas first, he just does the little sins. And then second, his little sins lead to big opposition to others bringing the honor and the worship and the glory to Jesus that Jesus inherently deserves. Now, Judas is specifically focused on money, which Jesus warns us about. Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. 1 Timothy 6:10 says, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and have pierced themselves with many griefs. I think that describes Judas. Jesus says you can't serve two masters. Judas chose money, and he wandered from the faith, and man, he pierced himself with many griefs. But there's more. In John 13:2, with like a preview statement of what's happening in this Last Supper. The evening meal is in progress, same meal that's at the center of our story today. The evening meal is in process, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. I find it interesting that here, Judas is prompted and not entered. He's prompted and not entered. The Greek phrase is more literally put into the heart of Judas, and it derives its meaning from this word that if you've taken first year Greek class, it's a word that means like to throw or to cast. And I mean, the idea here is simply that Satan just lobbed the bomb up at Judas' heart. And it seems to have landed. But I was reminded as I read this of Proverbs 4:23, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. I also thought about the armor of God and the protection that is described in the book of Ephesians. And I just wondered, like as Judas kind of did these small sins that seemed inconsequential, and then that led him to standing in opposition to the worship of Jesus. I wonder, even then, if he had just tried to guard his heart a little bit, if the grenade of Satan, the prompting of Satan, if it wouldn't have landed. Like if he just would have protected his heart and he would have been working to stay true to Jesus and faithful to Jesus, like maybe that grenade wouldn't have landed. Maybe it just would have brushed off. It would have fallen to the ground and Judas would have gone on his merry way, serving and being faithful to Jesus for the rest of his life and for eternity. Judas, his heart was unguarded. And so when Satan comes along and prompts him, he lobs this idea at him, it enters into his heart. I think we could make the case that the idea entered Judas. The idea entered Judas before Satan entered Judas. Now, to be totally fair to all of it, in Luke 22:3, we read, then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And so it appears that Satan entered Judas at two different points. And even within that, I thought about that. Like, that's such an interesting idea. He entered him twice. Like, what if Judas, after that first time Satan enters him, he puts this idea, and now he's thinking, I'm going to sell out Jesus. Like, what if at that moment he just would have chosen repentance and he would have said, I'm not doing this anymore? Then maybe this Last Supper looks very, very different. In Matthew 26:14-16, then one of the 12, the one called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and asked, what are you willing to give me if I deliver him over to you? So they counted out for him 30 pieces of silver. From then on, Judas watched for an opportunity to hand him over. Again, I mean, here's another step, right? He's taking these actual real steps to betray Jesus. So you go back, little sin, standing in the way of worship. And then there's this other step where he's like, what will I gain if I reject Jesus, if I betray Jesus, if I become a traitor to Jesus, what do I gain? That's another big step. This is Satan. Man, I can't stop calling him Satan, which is a Freudian slip of sorts, I think, in this story. But Judas takes real and active steps towards betrayal before the final moment of being a traitor. Judas takes steps. He takes this big step in the end of saying, what will I gain from leaving this guy behind, from turning this guy in, from leading to his arrest? It's strike three. I mean, here's Judas. He chose sin over service. He didn't guard his heart. He took real steps towards betrayal. And I would tell you, if you don't want to be a disciple of Jesus, if you want to move further away from Jesus, then follow Judas in this. But if you want to be a better disciple, if you want to follow Jesus more closely, then avoid these things at all costs. If you have little sins in your life that feel just like they'll never matter, nobody will know, just get rid of them. Just get rid of them. If you found that you're bothered by people trying to live a holy life, or that you are doing things that, to prevent the worship of Jesus, I'll tell you one from my own life. There was a time when I wasn't living the way I should, and I hated going to church because of it. Because I'd sit there and feel guilty the whole time, and I still went by habit or something. But I hated showing up to church on Sundays because it was like, here I go again, thinking about how far off I am. That's a sign. That's a sign that something is amiss, and you may have taken some steps towards betraying Jesus. And then never take the big step of saying, you know what? What will I gain if I leave this Jesus guy behind? And so, as you probably know, it's culturally famous even, in John 18, 2-5. Now Jesus, who betrayed him, knew the place. Jesus is out praying in the garden because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas the traitor was standing there with him, and it tells us in the other Gospels that he kissed him, and that's how he identified Jesus. And so Judas now goes through with the worst of all sins. I mean, it's the worst thing that we can think of in all the world, basically, is this single moment. Now, I don't know if you know the rest of the story of Judas, but he sees this, what happens to Jesus, that he's arrested and being tortured. And I'm not going to read it to you, but in Matthew 27, 3-5, you see that he tries to return the silver to the religious leaders. There's some guilt there. And then he commits suicide. And so he feels bad. And then later, you can move forward in the book of Acts. They're trying to replace Judas as one of the disciples. And Peter talks about Judas, and he points to how it fulfills prophecy again. And then he describes his suicide in more graphic detail. And then he calls the act wickedness. And it talks about how this field was purchased with the money, and that field is where Judas committed suicide. And then nobody wanted to buy it. It was called the field of blood. And then in Acts 1:25, it says this, which Judas left to go where he belongs. And it really appears to be a statement about Judas going to hell. Now, what I'm going to say next is probably controversial, but I'll just tell you what I really think. I believe pretty deeply that even after he greeted Jesus with that kiss, betraying him, the one who had befriended him by grace and allowed for him to be a part of his ministry, and the one who actually was dying for humanity's sins, even after that moment, I believe that Judas could have repented of it all, and he could have turned back to Jesus. He didn't have to go to hell. Now I know there's some theological nuances there that people could argue against, but I mean, in so many ways, I think the story of Judas is the story of me and all of us. I think that while Judas was the one who physically and literally betrayed Jesus, I think that's each and every one of us have done that. We've betrayed Jesus. We've sinned against him. We've stood in the conflict to his worship. Our hearts were totally open to everything in the world. And so when Jesus was arrested and tried and beaten and mocked and tortured and nailed to a cross, all of that was because we too have betrayed Jesus. And he was going to that cross in order that we might be forgiven for that betrayal. That's what we believe as Christians, that each and every one of us have turned to sin and we've rejected God and we've betrayed God. We've made ourselves enemies of God. And Jesus lovingly and graciously died so that we might be forgiven for that. And I think about Judas and like, what if he just would have just looked at the death of Jesus and instead of just feeling guilty and trying to pay his own penance, quite literally by giving the silver back, what if he just would have understood the story and said, you know what, I did this, but it was done for me. I did this, but it was done for me. I think that Judas, he didn't have to end the way he did, and he could have spent eternity in heaven with the same Jesus that he rejected, just like you and I can, if we'll believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, who came to die for our sins so that we might be forgiven and live forevermore in the wonderful confines of heaven. In John 60, 70 through 71, it says, Jesus replied, have I not chosen the 12? Yet one of you is a devil. He meant Judas, the son of Iscariot, who though one of the 12 was later to betray him. I mean, what a harsh statement, right? But I just don't think it had to be that way. I don't think it was like determined that, it was known by God clearly, right? And God uses that. God makes it a prophecy, shows that Jesus knew ahead of time so that we might believe, but it just didn't have to be that way. And so I would say to all of you, don't take the steps that are going to lead you to a place that you never thought you could get. My brother-in-law, Matt, he's probably said this here, but he read this book once that stuck with both of us. I never read it. He just told me about it. And it's this guy who wrote this book in order to say Christianity is not real. It's fake. It's not true. And here's all the reasons. But he opens this book by saying, my church found out about some sin in my life, and it made me mad. And so I decided to reject Christianity. It's kind of a cop-out. You can't just disprove something after you don't like it. That doesn't feel fair to me, but think about that now. I think about this guy. I don't know his name. I don't know the name of the book. If he would have gone 3 years before he wrote this book, 5 years before he wrote this book, kind of trying to disprove Christianity, and he would have said, as he's raising his hands in church on a Sunday, worshiping Jesus, do you think that you could ever, possibly ever in a million years, write a book trying to dissuade people away from following Jesus? What would he have said? No, absolutely not. There's no way. That can never happen. I'll never do that. But then, sin, right? Not guarding the heart, taking steps away from Jesus, fighting against his worship, and then writing a book trying to convince other people to do it too. If you're a person who's just committing little sins, stop. If you're a person who's not guarding your heart, start. If you're a person who's taking some steps away from Jesus, talk to me. Let's move the other direction. Let's not go that way, because that way is no good. But also, probably more for people online, but maybe some of you here, some of you probably feel like you have. I already had my kiss Jesus on the cheek betrayal moment, and I'm sitting here feeling guilty about it. I would just ask, I'd beg you not to let your past betrayal of Jesus dictate your future and your eternity? I think of this other guy who is a close colleague of Billy Graham, who ministered with Billy Graham, and he rejected Jesus kind of famously. Like, I don't believe all that stuff anymore. At the end of his life, near the end of his life, he's doing an interview, and somebody asked the question, like, what do you think of Jesus now? And he starts weeping. He's weeping. And he just says, I really miss him. Now, I don't know what's behind that. I don't have an explanation for why he said that. But I wonder if he was holding so tightly to his betrayal that he refused to repent and return to Jesus. And I would say for any of you who look at your life and think, I have betrayed Jesus, I just say, come back to him. He died for that. You don't need to stay far away from Jesus because of what you have done. We've all done it. Return to Jesus. Don't let the past betrayal determine your future and your eternity. Return to Jesus because he died so that you could be saved even from that thing that now you are holding over yourself and saying, wow, I'd love to get back to Jesus, but look what I did. And I'll tell you, giving back the money is never going to do it. Suicide is not going to do it. Like, there's only one way back, and it's through the blood that he shed on the cross. And so, even if you've already taken all those steps and you feel like Satan at some point entered you and you did something you never thought you can do, return to Jesus. He wants you back. Don't take steps that will lead to betraying Jesus, but if you have, return to him. That's what I want you to hear today. Let me pray for you. Lord Jesus, I thank you for being such a forgiving God. I thank you that, you say it in your word, right? You say like we were your enemies. Apart from you, Jesus, and what you did on the cross, we're your enemies. And yet you loved us enough to come and to die for our sins, and I'm so grateful for that. And I pray for those sitting in front of me, and I know, God, probably every one of us have little things that just seem like they're not that important, sins that don't seem like that big a deal. I pray right now in this moment you'd convict people of that, and I pray you'd help people to start to remove sin and guard their hearts, and if they've taken steps away, help them to take steps back. And Lord, I think about how you say to count the cost, and I think, Lord, some people, they count the cost and they say it's not worth it, and I pray that they would know that it is, that you would convince them that it is, Lord, and so God, help us to not take steps that will lead to us doing things that we never could have imagined. And where we are, Lord, show us and reveal those steps to us and help us to go the other direction. Help us to run, God. Help us to sprint right back into your arms. And for those, Lord, who are either not Christians, God, just because they've never thought about you or whatever it might be, or never believed, I pray that you would speak to their souls this afternoon, and you would, as it says in John, that you would draw them to yourself, Lord. And I pray, God, that you speak loudly or softly, but you would compel them to at least consider a relationship with you. But I pray they would choose a relationship with you. And maybe some of them, God, maybe some people are listening and they're just like, I've done too much. But I pray that they would remember how incredibly, ridiculously gracious you are, Lord, and they would come back to you, and they would not, please, God, let them not let the betrayal that they've done in the past dictate their future, but let them repent and return to you. I pray all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen.